weather and climate often cause concern and curiosity, but understanding the facts behind the phenomena can be a challenge. We're here to help. From the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and Illinois Public Media, welcome to Weather Realness, a weekly podcast about the skies above Illinois and the world.
I'm your host, Steve Nesbitt, professor in the Department of Climate, Meteorology, and Atmospheric Sciences here at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Temperatures are soaring across parts of the U.S.
We want to now talk about the hot temperatures that are just baking the Southwest right now. Out in Arizona and California, they have hit the century mark, and we all know come June and July, well, we'll be hoping.
From California to the plains, scorching temperatures. In Phoenix, 105-degree temperatures for a third straight day, tying the all-time March record. Officials say more than 400 people were treated for heat-related issues. About 25 people rushed to local hospitals.
A March heat wave shattered records across the West and High Plains, with more than 100 record highs were broken or tied last week. Martinez Lake, Arizona is one of those places, which recorded a high of 112 degrees on Friday, March 20th.
You will never know if you look right now that this was the hottest spot yesterday in the country, but the sun is shining and people are already kicking off a spring weekend. And even though it's spring, it feels like summer. Summer came a little early.
Said they got everybody out here at 110 degrees yesterday. It broke the record in the United States, right?
Yesterday, Martinez Lake broke the record as the hottest place in the U.S.
The National Weather Service issued multiple heat advisories last week. This is the first time in history a warning like this has been issued in March for the U.S. Here to talk about last week's record-breaking temperatures is Trent Ford, Illinois State climatologist with the Prairie Research Institute. Thanks for joining us, Trent.
Yeah, thanks, Steve.
So we're talking heat waves and early spring. What makes this early heat wave in March so unusual?
Yeah, well, like you mentioned and emphasized, the month of March, to see triple digits in parts of Arizona, Nevada, California, is not a rarity in June, certainly July and August. Those are the typically the climatologically hottest months of the year, which is why they make up meteorological summer. To have these kinds of temperatures in March, we're talking in some cases, 30 to in some cases approaching 40 degrees above average, is extremely rare. As you mentioned, having a heat advisory or heat warning this early in the spring it's hard to sort of emphasize the rarity of this type of event, other than just noting that hundreds of local all-time March records were broken. In fact, in some regions of the country, including the West, there were more weather stations that set new all-time March temperature records than didn't. And that's something that is just showing the extent of the heat that happened and again, the rarity of it having this early.
Yeah, and this is kind of exacerbating a lot of issues that we're seeing with water in the western United States. For those of you that have been out there or following the news, the snowpack in the Rockies is beyond horrible right now. Can you talk a little bit about how this potential event might connect with runoff that we expect for water supplies out west?
Yeah, absolutely. So, heat and drought are actually pretty well related, especially during the warm season. Oftentimes, drought, especially the prolonged drought, is forced by the same kind of atmospheric pattern that heat is with the big ridge. As I mentioned, the ridge really brings a lot, and the high pressure system that it can generate brings a lot of cloudless days, a lot of abundant sunshine, and very little precipitation or kind of dynamic weather like storms that we can speak of. So that for days is not a problem. People kind of like nice sunny weather, but for longer periods of time, weeks, in some cases months, that can really add up to a lot of drought. And so when we get that drought condition, and those that abundant sunshine, it really heats up the land and the air above it very, very quickly. And so we can get kind of an amplification of that heat. So that's kind of a feedback between drought and heat, but it works the other way too, where the heat actually dries out the soil much more quickly. and through evaporation. And so what that does is in the West is really two things. One, it makes it, of course, when temperatures are 112, we're not getting snowfall, which is a really important part of water supply for the West. The second part is that even in the areas higher up in elevation, the mountains that have gotten snowfall, once that snow melts, which it will much more quickly than average, it's going to run off, and that runoff is going to be soaked in much more effectively by those extremely dry soils, which means that less of that runoff gets to the reservoirs where that water is then subsequently used in the summer times.
Yeah, I saw a report from KUNC out in Colorado that as of March, Lake Powell's at critical low water levels.
Along the Utah-Arizona border, Lake Powell draws crowds every year, known for fishing, boating, and more. But right now, this is what the lake looks like, very different to those who know it best.
In a month or two, it's going to be probably as low as I've seen it.
Lake Powell is only 25 to 27% full, and you can see the water levels have dropped over this past year. As lake levels drop, hazards are surfacing from below.
That obviously is going to impact power generation for areas like Las Vegas, and also water supplies for agriculture this summer. Pretty devastating effects there.
Yeah, and this is a problem that, this kind of long-term trend of drying, what we call aridification out west is something that, we've seen for several decades now. One of the things about Lake Powell that differs from reservoirs that we have here in Illinois is that once it reaches those really low stages in the spring, there's not much chance of it recovering by summer and fall because they just simply do not get much rain there during the summertime. Whereas here we could see reservoirs like Lake Decatur or Ren Lake really hit low levels in the spring, but we get more abundant precipitation in the summer. That means that at least has a chance of recovering. And so that long persistence of a system like Lake Powell means that, whenever they see this time of the year, and especially as moving to April and May, they're pretty much locked into this summer.
In terms of connections to climate, thinking about our current situation, can you talk a little bit about sort of the large scale forcing mechanisms right now? We've been hearing about a La Nina event, but that sounds like that is coming to an end, perhaps.
Yeah, so we've had a La Nina event, which is cooler sea surface temperatures, sort of in the tropical Pacific, that are caused by a relaxation excuse me, an invigoration of trade winds, and across the tropical Pacific, that tends to affect the flow of the jet stream, the subpolar, subtropical jet stream, the movement of energy and waves, atmospheric waves and storms, and just general weather patterns across the entire globe, including here in the northern hemisphere across the US. And so that is quickly dying. We will likely lose an official La Nina status perhaps by the end of March, but more likely in April. And we actually, the forecasts look for a maybe potential flip to El Nino. And there's some relationship with La Nina like flow, where we can get these kinds of patterns set up. One thing that we've seen, particularly over the last few weeks, has been this amplification of for lack of a better term, the waviness in the jet stream. So folks I shouldn't even say may remember. It's very clear in people's memories that we've had a lot of dynamic weather here in Illinois. We've had, of course, the storms, the tornadoes, and hail that was experienced in Northeast Illinois. The temperature swings from some places being 6 degrees to 90 degrees almost, and the 2 feet of snow that then melted really quickly because it was 80 degrees. And usually in the United States, when we have crazy weather in one place, there's crazy weather somewhere else. And it just so happens that that big ridge, you can imagine the jet stream kind of bulging northward like it's going over the ridge of a mountain over the western US. Well, that corresponded to a pretty intense trough downstream of that, which is a kind of a dipping of that jet stream, which made for a really active storm track across the central US and also some quite variable temperatures. So we were warm and then we were extremely cold, then we were back to warm. And so that sort of dynamic environment across the United States right now has really made for some just absolutely crazy weather. And but it also reminds us that what's going on here in Illinois is connected to what's going on, what we call upstream in the Western US, as well as what's going on in Europe and other places. So yeah, it's interesting to see those connections and again to see some of the big differences about what's happening west versus east of the Mississippi River, for example.
Yeah, our jet stream is largely connected to what's going on way out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, and we're still kind of learning about how all those connections work in different situations, which is a lot of very, very active area of research. So,
Sure.
in terms of thinking about this on longer time scales, you mentioned sort of the persistent drought that may be developing over the Southwest. Is this a hallmark of climate change in any way?
So, yes and no. The extreme heat that we have seen over the Western US last week, that has a very strong climate change fingerprint on it. So, attribution of any individual weather event to climate change, to long term climate change, is really tricky. 10 years ago, most climate scientists would have told you it's impossible or sort of fool's errand. We've seen a real growth in what we call weather attribution, especially rapid weather attribution in the last 10 years or so in climate science, meaning that we take any given weather event like a heat wave or a hurricane or whatever it may be, and try to estimate, okay, how likely is this, or would this type of event be without human caused climate change? And so it's an imperfect type of technique, but it's something that can give us an idea for how extreme this was, and the perhaps, like I said, the kind of the fingerprint of climate change. For this particular heat wave, similar to the 2021 heat wave we saw in the Pacific Northwest, this type of heat would have been virtually impossible or extremely unlikely without human caused climate change, just because the right dynamics, which is really the position of the jet stream, the height of the ridge, those kind of things, we've seen. It's very rare, but we've seen those kind of dynamics before. But the thermodynamic response, which is how hot the air got, for example, at 112 degrees, 100, in some places, that is aided by this background warming this time of the year that we've seen as a long-term trend of climate change. But there's also a lot of evidence that points to these long-term patterns. So we've mentioned La Nina in the Pacific Ocean. Something that's interesting, and there's actually, as you know, some folks there in the climates department in at U of I who are studying this. That in recent decades, the Pacific has had this kind of this sort of trend of more La Nina like conditions, which tend to relate to drought issues out west, and so having these kind of prolonged La Nina-esque like conditions in the resulting flow in the atmosphere has undoubtedly contributed to this decades-long drought in the Southwest. At the same time, that increase in evaporation and aridity that we see from climate change has also made that whole situation worse.
So you're listening to Weather Realness, the weekly podcast about the climate and weather. We're talking to Trent Ford, Illinois State climatologist with the Prairie Research Institute. The fact that this was so early in the season is, as you mentioned, is really unusual. Can you talk a little bit about how that sort of uniquely impacts the people in Arizona, Nevada, southern Utah, California, compared to one that would be in the summertime?
So, folks who are living in this part of the country are used to extreme heat, but they're just like we in Illinois are used to extreme cold or tornadoes, for example. But we're used to those extremes in certain times of the year. When it comes to extreme heat, getting a really early season heat wave affects individuals, affects people physiologically because your body has gone through winter, it's been cooler, and it hasn't really built up that acclimatization to the extreme heat. So we tend to see that heat waves of equal magnitude that happen earlier in the season, like May, June, tend to result in increased mortality and morbidity versus the same intensity heat wave that occur later in the season, July, August, September, because people by that time have built up that acclimatization. So that is one way that these types of early season heat waves can really cause problems. Another way is that when we get this type of extreme heat and the kind of dynamic atmospheric conditions that produce that, it's really not conducive to a lot of precipitation, certainly not a lot of snow. And like you mentioned, a lot of the power generation in the West is still reliant on that hydropower, so the runoff, the snow melt, to run those turbines and generate that electricity. And of course, having this early season heat wave, it means that people are turning on their air conditioning units, right? Using more electricity. So it can cause an early kind of problem with supply and demand if energy companies weren't prepared to have to meet that kind of higher demand for energy earlier in the season.
So finally, cooler air slid into the northern and central U.S. on Sunday, March 22nd. Reports say that cooler temperatures won't last long. Looks like we're heading back up and then back down after this event. You mentioned a little bit about the storm track being pretty active. Is there a connection here between the heat wave and our active weather that you can describe?
Yeah, when we have the storm, the jet stream, the storm track that kind of moves the flow of the atmosphere across the United States. One pattern in one part of the US is connected to a pattern in another part of the US. And so while we were getting that cool air on the backside of that low pressure system that came through in those storms, that was really the peak time of the heat out west. And so while they were dealing with that big ridge pattern, we were dealing with more of a troughing pattern, and so a pretty big disparity in those temperatures. And so, yeah, I mean, the overall, what we saw though is a quick drop in temperatures, and then another rise. So, later this week, it looks like we may see temperatures get up into the 90s in some part of Illinois. So we're not being spared as that ridge out west has opened up and kind of blasted us with some heat as well. And that's what we look at when we see the outlook for the next month or so through April and really all the way through the end of spring and May is above best chances for above average temperatures, but also above average precipitation, indicating that the models are really suggesting to us that we're going to continue this active storm track, but also more likely than not have these milder or warmer periods of time when we're sort of being hit with that warmer air from the Gulf of Mexico or from the Southwest, as opposed to getting these kind of prolonged cold episodes that we can get in April and May. So when I look at April, May, wetter, warmer, it indicates to me that probably going to be some active weather across the Midwest.
Yeah, I think we're already well above normal in terms of tornadoes here in Illinois. We talked about this last week. Unfortunately, the last 2 years we've led the nation in tornadoes, and this year seems to be no exception. Can you talk about relationships here between this variability that we're seeing and some of this active severe weather we're seeing?
Yeah, absolutely. The ingredients of a tornado, right? It needs instability, which means it needs that energy coming from heat as well as energy through humidity, and through water in the air. Um, but we also need, oftentimes the right kinds of again, the dynamic patterns where we're getting the kind of right conditions for different flow of the atmosphere at different levels that can create what's called wind shear. You guys talked about this a little bit last week, where you have differences in wind speed or direction with height in the atmosphere. And oftentimes that happens really effectively along boundaries or fronts. So fronts are just boundaries between different air masses. So if you think about that jet stream moving, that jet stream oftentimes sort of dictates the a large boundary between cooler air and warmer air. So if we get the right dynamics, we can get really good, and I say good not for people, but good for meteorologists as opposed storm formation right along those boundaries. And so when you get that dynamic flow of the jet stream combined with abundant amounts of moisture and humidity in the air and just heat overall, you can get those are really the right ingredients to not just have a tornado, but to have what we often experience here in the Midwest, which are these tornado outbreaks that are resulting from these kind of larger storm systems, that the quasi-linear convective systems that haunt us at night oftentimes, where you see kind of one line of storms stretching from Lake Michigan to the Ozarks, right? And have tornado warnings sort of all along that. So most often are more active springs, March, April, May, and even into June when it comes to tornadoes and severe weather are also those types of springs where we have a really dynamic jet stream, where we also have abundant amounts of humidity. And there was some work, I don't know, maybe 10, 15 years ago that really well correlated La Nina springs with heightened tornado activity in the Midwest. And that's what we're coming out of that La Nina pattern, but that dynamic flow, the active jet stream, the abundant moisture from the Gulf, those things are all really conducive to active severe weather.
Yeah, so the good news is that perhaps the silver lining of having more active severe weather is that we can maybe start to recover from the drought that we're in here in central Illinois, although we would prefer a nice gentle rain, obviously, to perhaps heavy rain and hail. But getting back to the heat question, we certainly have had our fair share of heat waves in the past. Typically for us, they're in the summer. Is there a difference between heat waves that develop here in the Midwest and those that develop in the West? You mentioned the 2021 event that was during the summer and now this spring event.
Yeah, the dynamics that set up a heat wave are very similar in across the across the U.S., whether it's the Western U.S., the Midwest, the East. Um, Of course, when you're talking about the West Coast, we're talking about a little bit more of a significant input from the ocean as well. So there could be these features called marine heat waves, which are heat waves that set themselves up primarily over the oceans, but that can be conducive to some pretty warm air movement off of oceans into the land. Also, topography of the Western U.S. means that we get a little bit of a different kind of feeling as well. But generally speaking, the larger scale atmospheric environment is pretty similar. The big difference between the Midwest and, let's say, the Southwest of the U.S. or the Southeast of the U.S. is when we get these kind of setups, we're just talking about a different kind of population, demographics, kind of human systems that are affected. So one of the most obviously the heat wave on its own in the Pacific Northwest in 2021 was extreme just on its own. If that would have occurred anywhere in the U.S., that would have been extreme. But what made it particularly noteworthy is that it occurred in an area of the U.S. that does not experience heat waves very often. Just the by nature of where it is located geographically and kind of the movement of air off the Pacific, the Pacific Northwest does not experience heat waves very often. And so to get that kind of extreme event is really particularly impressive is the word that comes to mind, but it wasn't because of how devastating it was. But certainly here in the Midwest, we deal with our fair share of heat waves, and they can have those significant impacts as well. I mean, the 1995 Chicago heat wave always comes to mind, and we look at the dynamic setup for that type of heat wave, the ridging pattern, the high pressure that was just to our northeast, very, very similar kind of setup as what was experienced in the West. The biggest difference was that it was in the middle of summer. It was also extremely humid in the Midwest, as it often is in late July, and it occurred over the third most populous city in the country, one that still doesn't have as much heat resilience as places that experience more frequent heat waves, like Las Vegas or Phoenix.
Yeah, I guess the other big difference is obviously the landscape, right? The fact that our corn sweats that sometimes we loathe here in the summertime do actually help protect us from heat waves when the atmospheric forcing is maybe not so strong. And it really affects how the sun's energy is partitioned as it comes in. Of course, out west, you've got these, desert landscapes that all the energy that's coming in from the sun basically turns into heat because you're not spending that energy trying to evaporate water off the surface. Whereas here in the Midwest, we have this partitioning where some of the energy goes into heat, but then some of it also goes into evaporating water off the ground and out of the plants. So, can you talk about how the corn actually helps us a little bit in that sense?
Yeah, so like you mentioned, I mean, the our landscape is wetter. We have more water availability, either by plants uptaking it from the soil or just having more water on the ground, wetter soils overall. And like you mentioned, when that energy comes in from the sun, it's going to evaporate that water. And that is a heat transfer to the atmosphere, but we don't necessarily experience it as heat would be as if we're just directly heating the temperature of the air like they would more effectively in the Southwest. So that can sort of what that does is it tends to depress those daytime high temperatures. So it's fairly rare that here in Champaign we get above 100 degrees during the summertime. We'll have every once in a while, but oftentimes the 100-degree days correspond with drought because our landscape is much drier than it normally would be. So we get more of that kind of southwest kind of feel of heat. But the reason that we don't get up into the triple digits as often is because when that sun comes out on a very hot day with very little wind, it's evaporating that moisture. The corn is actively transpiring as well as other parts of the landscape. And some of that heat that would have gone to raise that temperature well above 100 degrees is now evaporating the water and is stored as humidity in the atmosphere. So it does tend to depress those daytime high temperatures. On the flip side, it also tends to elevate the nighttime temperatures. So when you're out in the desert Southwest in the middle of July, you're standing on the Las Vegas Strip, it's going to be 100. It easily can get to 110, 115 degrees. But if you can wait till 9 or 10 p.m., it's going to dip down into the 70s, sometimes even below that, depending on the right conditions. And that can actually feel quite nice. Here in the Midwest, we don't get that. The humidity sticks around. So yeah, it may only get to 95 during the day, but it's not going to get below 75 at night. And it's a different flavor of heat. And so what that means is that a lot of the resilience building, the adaptation strategies to deal with heat in the Southwest, some of those transfer here in the Midwest quite well, but some of them don't because of that difference in our kind of flavors of heat.
So for those of us just tuning in, you're listening to Weather Realness, the podcast about weather and climate. I'm Steve Nesbitt. Have a weather or climate question you want us to tackle? Leave us a voicemail at 217-333-2141 or email weatherrealness@illinois.edu.